Okay, great. So that just leaves me to introduce our speaker today. So we're really pleased to have Dr. Megan Maurer with us from New York University. And so Megan is a cultural anthropologist working at the intersections of urban landscapes, human well-being, and responses to the climate crisis. Her research uses multi-species ethnography and urban political ecology approaches to investigate how people perceive non-human life in urban landscapes and how these perceptions can inform the planning, design, and maintenance of cities that nurture justice, equity, and sustainability for all inhabitants. Megan is currently an adjunct research scholar at the Earth Institute, Columbia University, and will be starting a position as assistant professor in landscape architecture and planning at the University of Copenhagen this summer. And the title of Megan's talk today is Watching Spiders and Counting Bunnies, the role of nature in university students coping during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think just maybe before you kick off, Megan, if you could kind of, just because we're on Zoom, people are coming from all different parts of the world. It'd be great if you could just tell us where you are just before going into your presentation, but the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that welcome, Tom, and thank you to the Manchester Seminar Series for inviting me here. I am currently in Manhattan, New York City. I'm on the Upper West Side, and I live across from playgrounds. And so out my window, I see trees and children playing. And there's also a lot of street traffic. So I shut the window, but I cannot promise that there won't be some sort of very exciting, very loud noise that just sort of bubbles up. But yeah, I will be talking today about some work that I've been doing with collaborators at Columbia University and Barnard College here in New York to sort of understand the intersection of the COVID-19 pandemic and green space access and well-being with university students. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, is that good? And so before I get started, I would like to acknowledge my collaborators and co-authors on this project, Elizabeth Cook, Liv Yoon, Olivia Vishnik, Ben Orloff, Patricia Culligan, and Brian Mayu. We are a motley crew of anthropologists, ecologists, engineers, earth scientists, and kinesiologists who are all interested in one way or another in how green space can meet the needs of climate crisis response, human well-being, and environmental justice. I also want to acknowledge the funding that we had for this research project from the National Science Foundation in the United States and the Barnard College Summer Research Institute. Okay, so there we go. As I'm sure you are all aware, the COVID-19 pandemic elicited a series of responses in the US, including stay-at-home orders and social distancing mandates. We, as people who sort of think about and research green space access, kind of immediately began to wonder if these responses were going to change the accessibility of green space for people around the country. We know from previous research in environmental psychology and landscape architecture, environmental anthropology, many places, the benefits to humans of going outside and spending time around plants and animals. And so we were just kind of wondering what this dimension of the pandemic experience would look like for folks. And then we were sort of specifically wondering if people in suburban and rural settings would be faring better than those in urban areas where COVID-19 response measures had ostensibly the most effect, because green space access is sort of limited to public spaces. There aren't as many private green spaces in dense urban settings. And we had seen a lot of public park closures in New York and elsewhere. So when colleges and universities closed, and we are all sort of in, obviously, the university setting, teaching, mentoring, interacting with students. So we were acutely aware of how disruptive it was for campuses to be closed and for students to be sent home to all kinds of different spaces. And we thought that this actually, first and foremost was a call to us as educators and mentors to take care of our students. But the little researcher part of our brains also went, they're going all over the place. They're going, to their multi-generational apartment in Inwood, in Manhattan, or they're going to their vacation home in Martha's Vineyard out on the coast. There's a lot of different sort of variability in population density and landscape type in all these different places where these students are being sent home. This is a population we have access to as educators and mentors. And this is a population that has a sort of shared touch point of disruption during the pandemic. This COVID-19 affected people in many different ways and many different intersectional ways. And this is true of college and university students as well. But this sort of the event of having the campus shut down and being sent home was this kind of shared entry point or sort of common disruption that could kind of pull or hold this population together a little bit for us. And so that's where we started. And I'm sorry, keep pressing the wrong button to advance my slides. There we go. So we formulated a set of research questions. And we wanted to know what effect going outdoors for the purpose of being outside was having on students' assessments of their own well-being during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we were very careful to structure our questions about well-being in terms of self-assessment or a subjective assessment of well-being to allow an openness to people have really varied ways in which they construct a sense of being well in the world. And there are many different factors that contribute to that. And which ones are sort of primary, are highly variable. And rather than try and come into this with an objective definition of what it meant to be well, we were allowing students to sort of self-assess and self-report and tell us what they needed and what they were getting and what they weren't getting in order to have this sense of doing okay. Our second question was about how their access to green space changed during this period of disruption, particularly with respect to changes in the perceived risk of going outdoors. And then finally, we wanted to know if these changes in well-being and in access were influencing students' relationships to green space or nature, and vice versa, if the sort of prior relationships that students had to vegetation and to the natural world was influencing the ways that they responded to changes in green space access and to their well-being. So we created an online survey that we distributed to, sorry, my notes. We distributed to US-based colleges and universities. We started with sort of Barnard College and Columbia University, where we had direct access to the student body, but wanting a more diverse population, we tapped into our personal networks and our listservs to try and distribute this nationally. We had 71 colleges and universities across 46 states in the United States represented. So we were really pleased with the range of participants that we had in the study. In the survey, we gave people the option to volunteer for a follow-up interview to be conducted over Zoom. And just, I've never written an IRB for an online survey, let alone Zoom interviews. That was a real illuminating process. And we were fortunate to be working with a really understanding IRB that was helping us kind of figure out some of the ethical issues that go along with doing Zoom interviews with a college student during a pandemic. But what I, rather than talk about those sort of bureaucratic specifics, I do want to talk a little bit about what it was like to be an anthropologist in this interdisciplinary setting, developing this research project. Because while the pandemic required us to think differently about how we structured our research, we are all, whether ecologists, engineers, anthropologists, we are all sort of site-specific researchers. We had specific locations where we were studying. None of us had done something like a national survey with a dispersed population before. So this was new. But it also required me to think differently about how I did anthropological research. Namely, what does it mean to take an anthropological approach in the absence of participant observation and other ethnographic methods? I was really careful to say, and continue to be careful to say, like, this is not ethnography. We did not do ethnography. I'm not sure what we did. We did something else. And so fortunately for me, I've been doing research in an interdisciplinary space for several years now. So I've already been kind of reflecting and publishing with peers on this topic about what it means to work in an interdisciplinary space for some time. But this was a kind of acute situation that called for a real proactive consideration of these questions rather than kind of reflecting on things I had done. I really needed to think ahead to what I was going to do and how I was going to do it. And I wanted to sort of use this opportunity to share kind of 3 points of reflection from my experience that I think are that are interesting or worthwhile. One was that anthropological approaches to asking questions and interpreting data don't really change and remain valuable. And this is something that I've sort of brought into interdisciplinary research and into this project specifically. But the way that anthropologists think about crafting a question and the questions we ask about the questions that we ask, and that remains incredibly valuable. And also in terms of interpreting data and the way that we ask our data, you know, not just what is here, but what isn't here. And not just what isn't here, but why is it not here? And our willingness to look at one single data point and say, this may just be one data point, but let me pick it a little bit, because sometimes it unravels into something much bigger than you sort of see on the surface. And that kind of approach remains really valuable wherever it's being done. Second was the way that we thought about the survey and the interview in tandem. We developed them together and thought really deeply about how the survey questions could be used to do some of the work of providing background and context for our interviews. And so the surveys are by no means a substitute for the work of going out there and getting to know people and getting to know a place and the rhythms and the routines of daily life there. But in the absence of being able to do that, we thought about what kinds of questions can we ask in a survey that will give us a little pieces of information that we can then bring into an interview and help us start from the jump in that interview, understanding a little more where this person is at and where they're coming from. And that kind of leads into this third point, which is thinking really intentionally about interview questions in a way I had never done before. I think, you know, like many anthropologists, well, I'm projecting, at least for me and the anthropologists I have known, you kind of almost fall into interviews. You build rapport, you get to know people before you sit down with them. And this was not something that we were going to be able to do. And so it caused me to stop and think about, what's the first question that I'm asking? What's the second question? How are my questions building and leading into each other so that I'm getting to know this person and building rapport and building trust with them so that we can have a real conversation, even in this really kind of detached and abbreviated space and time. And we had a lot of discussion as an interview team and talking about what was working and what wasn't, and how we could kind of change or tweak our approach to continue to try and find a way to connect with people in this really abstracted kind of space. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. It was definitely a learning process. Uh, okay, sorry, my notes are not scrolling very well. And so finally, while we weren't really able to do an ethnographic component to this project, and what I'm going to present today is really a mixed methods paper and a mixed methods analysis, I'm going to try and kind of point out along the way the places where the kind of anthropological ways of asking and knowing serve to strengthen our research project from the design to the analysis. And so without further ado, what did we find? Our study population, as I said, distributed across the country. You can see the distribution nationally. And then if you zoom in on the Northeast, which is where sort of we had a larger proportion, you sort of see the breakdown between urban, suburban, and rural. About 60% of our population was white and 25% people of color. With the remainder there, people who reported one or more race. When compared to the undergraduate student population in the US, our sample aligns with the national demographics for white and Asian students, but we underrepresent Black, Hispanic, and Native American students. And that's something to keep in mind when we sort of talk about our findings and what they mean. They were relatively evenly distributed by class year. And we had about a 50-50 split for people who were receiving financial assistance and people who were not. As a result of the large participation of Barnard College students, which is an all-women's institution, our survey skews to nearly 70% of our respondents identifying as women, only 15% identified as men, with the remainder being non-binary or not reporting. We had sort of a nice breakdown in population density, about a quarter rural, a quarter suburban, and half of our sample lived in an urban area based on the US Census designation, which is determined primarily by population density. Okay, this is the part where I promise I'll just go relatively quickly. So we asked about subjective well-being or the sort of self-assessed, self-reported well-being at 3 moments in time overall at the time of survey and the last time they were outdoors. They were all significantly different from one another, and well-being while outdoors was the highest. If you had been outside in the last 24 hours, you had higher levels of well-being at the time of survey than if you had not. And then we looked at destination for well-being during your last trip outdoors. If you went to a park or a garden, someplace we knew was vegetated, you had significantly higher levels of well-being than if you had gone to what we call a local destination, which is a yard or a neighborhood walk where it's like, we have no way of knowing what that's like. And then the lowest were folks who had gone outside for the purpose of going to a store or a restaurant. When we look at perceived risk, we see that the more risky you think it is to be outside, the lower your well-being while outdoors. And this is sort of significantly lower here. Similarly, the riskier you thought it was to be outside, the less likely you were to have been outside in the last 24 hours. Not shocking, but good to see it represented. And then we asked specifically if people wanted to go outside more, but thought it was too risky. And again, for those who really agreed with that statement, who wanted to be outside more, but were afraid of the risk that it entailed, they had lower well-being, even when they did get outside. So we were able to see that risk, the perception of risk was playing a role in how happy and healthy people felt going outside was for them. Okay, go. We asked specifically about obstacles to access. This was an open-ended field on our survey, and so we were able to do a content coding analysis for these responses. By and large, barriers had to do with COVID-19. A quarter of them were crowding, followed by things like facility closures and just a general sort of fear of sickness. Far fewer respondents named non-COVID related barriers, and these were primarily time constraints. These were college students, they were in class. We heard some really fun rants about professors and their work assignment proclivities. And then physical access remained an issue for a small portion of our population. Real quick here, we tried to look at variation in well-being based upon population density. And we found that the improvement to your well-being when you go outdoors doesn't change regardless of your population density. So people in rural areas are on the whole kind of happier than people in urban areas. But if you look at sort of how their well-being improves when they go outside, there's no significant difference. So essentially, it doesn't matter where you are, going outdoors has this sort of same amount of measurable benefit. And then we were also interested in the type of green space. And you can see based on the population density, those who had no safe access to green space were much more likely to have been in an urban area. And those with access to only public green space were also much more likely to have been in an urban area. In terms of risk, those with no safe access to green space were much more likely to consider going outdoors risky than those who did not. Interestingly, it didn't matter if it was public or private green space, they had sort of the same perception of risk associated with it. And then we looked at the influence of the type of green space that you felt you had safe access to on well-being. And again, if you felt like you had no safe access to green space, you had a significantly lower level of well-being at the time of survey and when you went outdoors. So we found, essentially summing that up, public versus private green space didn't really matter. What mattered was whether you had any at all. End of stats. Thank you. So what we did in writing this paper and in the sort of analysis of these results was, rather than do this sort of classic, here are my stats and here's a pretty quote from my interview to illustrate what I found in my stats, we instead decided that we would engage our interviews in the discussion section of the paper. So we reported results where appropriate also from the interviews, but then in the discussion section, where sort of in a typical scientific paper, you put your results in conversation with previous research, we put our results in conversation with previous research and with our interviews. And that's where we brought in the interview data. And so we used the conversations that we had with people to kind of interrogate what we saw in our statistical analysis of the surveys. And so we were able to dig into questions like, why does going outside make people feel better? I can show you with my survey data that seems to be the case for the majority of people, but why is that happening? And we sort of identified three kind of main reasons. And one was, shockingly, simply a chance to get out. People just wanted to get out of their house. We also had a lot of people talking about the presence of nature and how it felt really good to just see trees, see plants, see birds, flowers, that it just was, that felt good at a time when few things felt good. And then finally, and what was really interesting to me was a number of people who were talking about how going outside to a park or a yard or taking a stroll through the neighborhood provided a sense of variety, comfort, and even normalcy. And I just love this quote where this woman said, "It's really comforting. I've been finding to be able to go outside and see trees and see people biking and going on walks and walking their dogs. Like, even though to my knowledge, everyone's practicing the proper precautions and they have masks on and they're keeping space, there's something just really nice about being in a space with other human beings and being outside." And I think that that's really done wonders for my mental health and made me just feel like you can carve out a simulation of normalcy, even in these circumstances, and it can still be safe. And we heard versions of this over and over. Like, it just feels good to see other people doing mundane things like mowing the lawn, walking the dog, seeing a neighbor in the park and waving hi, and just those little day-to-day things that I never noticed before, just being able to get out and have that really mattered to people. But as much as we were interested in the kind of why is it making people feel better to go outside, we really wanted to know what was preventing people from spending more time outdoors. What were the barriers to access? And so our interviews confirmed what we saw in our survey. The sort of overriding concern is COVID-19. And again, sort of in very similar ways. It came up in the interviews in very similar ways. And so by and large, we heard about crowding or the inability to maintain 6 feet of distance due to the available space in the park. Interestingly, we also started hearing a lot more about people wearing masks. In our survey, which was done fairly early in the spring, we didn't hear a lot about mask wearing, but by the time we did the interviews, which were mostly in late May and June, we were hearing a lot more concerns about non-compliance with mask orders. And so this led to a lot of people doing sort of versions of what this woman is describing here, of being like, there's just too many people, there's not enough space, people aren't obeying the rules. Like, I know it's good for me to go outside, but I'm trying to protect family members. And so I'm like making these really tough choices about when to go outside and whether to go outside. And that was a definite strain and barrier. We also encountered park closures. Numerous times when we asked about barriers to access in the interviews, people's first response was something along the lines of, well, it depends on the timeline, because parks were initially closed across the country and then sort of slowly reopened through the late spring and summer. And so we had people talking about there was nowhere to go, and they were just walking in streets because there was nowhere else to walk. And we also had a number of, keeping in mind these were university students, feeling a bit bold and sneaking into parks. I, thanks to these interviews, now know the back entrances to several state parks throughout the United States, if you ever need to sneak in. But to get back to this, what we started calling this sort of calculus of risk and this decision-making, because that kept coming up time and again. And so in our interviews, we really saw this as an opportunity, or began to see it as an opportunity as we continued interviewing people, to really dig into this and try and understand the kind of nuance in the relationship between perceiving risk, perceiving a benefit to going outside, and how you make a decision in that situation. And so we really sort of worked on getting people to kind of talk us through that decision-making process and how they weighed these really conflicting constraints between wanting to protect their health and the health of their family members, and also knowing that like they were hitting a wall mentally and emotionally staying inside so much. And so we heard a lot of versions of this quote here of being like, we started out really strong, we were doing great, and like I just hit a wall, I couldn't do it anymore. And I had to accept a little more risk into my life in order to maintain my mental and emotional health. And that was really difficult. And it manifested in a lot of different ways. And we had people who didn't go outside for months and were like, I'm losing it in here. And we had people who were like, yeah, I live with my roommate, I didn't go home and live with my parents. And so like, yeah, it's not really been a problem. So there was a large sort of range here of ways that people sort of navigated this space. Our interviews, though, in addition to sort of providing this kind of nuance about the decision-making process that people were going through, they also helped us see barriers to access that didn't really show up in our survey results, because we were asking specifically about COVID risk. We were asking about your primary obstacle to going outside. And so unsurprisingly, it was COVID-19. But when we were sort of talking to people and kind of asking them talk us through, what's it like where you live? Where do you go outside? How do you get there? What is it like for you to go? We were able to start unpeeling these layers of access and really understand access as this multi-dimensional, intersectional thing, and that COVID-19 was just one kind of point of say point of access to access. That's a terrible turn of phrase. But COVID-19 was just sort of one facet of the accessibility. And so we found that physical access and the intersectional nature of physical access to green space persisted, of course. In the United States, we know that African-American people, Indigenous people, people of color, and people living in lower than median income neighborhoods have less just physical park space available to them than other residents. And that doesn't go away during the pandemic. And so we have folks like this Latina woman in the Southeast Bronx who's like, there's no green space here. Like, I couldn't go if I wanted to. And it's not just the available green space, but it's the connectivity infrastructure, which again, we know is intersectional with inequalities based on race and class in the United States. And these continue to be a problem. And that even if there's green space available, you may not necessarily be able to get it because you don't have the proper connectivity infrastructure. And we saw this actually a lot with students who didn't have access to cars. And so while in urban areas, we heard people talking about there just aren't parks here, in rural and suburban areas, we had people talking about like, oh, there's a nice park, but like this woman, it's 2 miles away and there are no sidewalks. And you know, what's not in this quote here is that her family has 1 car. And she's like, my mom's using the car to like go to work. She's an essential worker. Like, I can't go. Like, I don't have the transit infrastructure to access these spaces. But it wasn't just the sort of physical accessibility in terms of available space and available infrastructure, but sort of the social and cultural barriers to access that persisted when we started to kind of peel away the layers. And one of those that was really interesting to engage with was about gendered safety concerns. And so this sort of manifested in 2 ways. We had women and non-binary and queer students telling us that they didn't feel safe going to parks because there were so few people in them. And that without a lot of people around, it made them feel more vulnerable. And then on the flip side, this woman here who is living in a dense city is saying that the only time the parks are like uncrowded enough for me to feel safe in terms of COVID-19 is when it's dark out. And as a woman, I don't feel safe in these parks in this city in the dark. And so she was like, I can't go. Like, there's no safe time or space for me. And then race and racist harassment persisted for our residents, as I was sort of, our students, sorry, as our sort of gesture to in the previous slides. Green space access in the United States is heavily structured by race and income and gender. In the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had another layer that was pandemic specific, but also race specific in terms of the anti-Asian violence and harassment. And that showed up in our interviews on more than one occasion when we had Asian students talking to us about the harassment that they had experienced, the assaults that they had witnessed, the fear that they had in public spaces, and the measures that they were taking to protect themselves, whether it was not going outside or whether it was things like carrying pepper spray and knives in their handbags. And so, you know, this is all just to underscore that while COVID-19 became this kind of overriding thing structuring access, racism persisted as a barrier to green space access for many, and highlighting that not all bodies are considered neutral presences in public space. And this is a reality that was echoed and witnessed in the continued harassment and murder of BIPOC during our study. And it just kept happening again and again and again. And so while our surveys show us how COVID-19 reveals new dimensions and barriers to accessibility, it's through our interviewing and the way that we sort of couple those two things together that we are able to see how barriers persist during the COVID-19 pandemic. And while this one sort of facet of access became primary, these other kinds of facets of access did not go away. In other words, those with racialized bodies and are living in majority BIPOC or lower than median income neighborhoods experienced further declines in accessible green space, compounding the already unequal toll of the COVID-19 pandemic and structural racism in the US. And I'll just refer to, I forgot to drop the citation in here, but some good colleagues of ours at the New School in the United States, Timon McPherson and the Urban Systems Lab, have been doing a really excellent job of, sorry. I'm so sorry. Oi, pop-up, update your My Adobe. Sorry, okay. Anyway, Timon McPherson and Urban Systems Lab at the New School has been doing a really excellent job documenting how the toll of COVID-19 in the United States, and particularly New York City, maps onto existing inequalities in race and income. Okay, so just a couple more, I'm going to go quickly through just a couple more sort of interesting findings that we are kind of developing in other papers that are coming out of this study. One is that where you are doesn't matter. And this was backed up in our interviews when we talked to people about, tell us about your green space. Where are you going? What's it like? They were like, well, which one? And there were always many. Even folks in cities, there were different parks that they were going to, different rooftop gardens that they were going to. In the suburbs, people were like, actually, my favorite green space is walking by my neighbor's yard. It really didn't matter where people were. We also have been looking a lot at nature as a coping mechanism. And this was, I had hoped to just present this paper today, but we weren't quite ready for it. But we are trying to sort of better understand the ways that nature became a coping mechanism for university students during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we sort of roughly identified kind of two pathways for that. First, people who had not really explicitly made a connection between their well-being and spending time outdoors, but were sort of active outdoorsy people, either for their study or for recreation. They spent a lot of time outdoors. And it was just during this time that they began to reflect on how important that time was for them and how it benefited them mentally and emotionally. The other kind of pathway for this that we've identified is those who prior to the pandemic had made this explicit connection between spending time in the natural world and being able to cope with different kinds of stress and duress. And these were folks who talked about previous mental health issues and struggles with depression and anxiety, and how, spending time outside, observing birds and identifying trees and things like that had been part of how they had managed their depression and anxiety prior to the pandemic. And we had numerous people say, like, actually, I'm doing so much better than my peers right now because I've been here. Like, this is not my first rodeo. Like, I know what I need to be mentally and emotionally healthy. And I know that spending time outside is part of that. And so I'm actually equipped here because I've struggled with my mental health in the past, which was really fascinating. And then I also want to highlight a forthcoming paper from Olivia Visnick, who's been looking at new connections to nature. Because while the folks who sort of already understood or already had a relationship with the outdoors were doing sort of better than those who didn't, it's those who didn't have sort of a prior connection to nature before the pandemic. There were several of them who were sort of discovering it for the first time And for some, this was out of necessity because they were stuck inside or in their yards, and they just started being, when a New Yorker tells you that they've developed a really close personal attachment to a pigeon, you know things are bad. And we had more than one student be like, I've really gotten into watching the pigeons on the fire escape. And you're like, oof, it's rough out there. But it was also very interesting to see people be like, you know what, I never thought of pigeons as nature before. I never cared about them. But now that they're sort of all I have, pigeons matter. And I think I'm always going to love pigeons now. Like they have a special place for me. And that's sort of really fascinating to see that new relationship forming. And then for others, this sort of new connections come through a steady routine of walks in the park or runs in the neighborhood that provide new opportunities to practice these kinds of arts of noticing, right? People who are like, I never used to be a runner, but I can't go to the gym, so now I run. And I noticed all the bunnies in the park when I run. So I started measuring my morning runs in terms of the number of bunnies I see. And it's like, oh, well, what was today's run? Today was a 5-bunny run. That's a pretty good one. And it's like, what an interesting way to be in the world. And so Olivia is really exploring this finding in this paper and trying to really put it in the context of the climate crisis and what we can think about forming new connections to nature during times of social and ecological disturbance and duress. And so I think I'm at 40 minutes, so I'm going to just wrap up by highlighting sort of 2 main conclusions from this research project that we highlight in the sort of paper I've been reporting on, and then the sort of forthcoming ones as well. And one of those conclusions is that we need to plan for changing accessibility rather than thinking of accessibility as something that is sort of one-dimensional and static. As people who are interested in green space design and planning and management, we need to think about it as multidimensional, as intersectional, and as changing, and that sort of where you are at in space and time, where you are at in terms of moments of social ecological disturbance and sort of widespread duress is going to shift which sort of facets of access become primary. And we need to have a more holistic understanding of what access means so that we can plan for green spaces that are accessible under a variety of conditions. Heat waves, pandemics, storms, floods, these are all things that we can expect more of, and all things that are going to change the accessibility of green space. And so a more proactive and holistic understanding can maybe help us cope with these moments as they come. And then second, it's not a shocker, but it needs to be said over and over and over. We need equitable reparative investment in public green space. We didn't find that where people were mattered in terms of the benefits that they got from green space. And so if we're thinking about how do we make investments in green space that are going to benefit people, public green space gets more of this to more people. A private green space is great, but it's only accessible to those who sort of own that property. A public green space is accessible to all and provides the same benefits that a private green space does. In addition, investing in public green spaces can help us address critical issues regarding environmental justice and the disparities in access that we observed, that have been observed in previous research and that we observed here. And I would just want to sort of highlight when I talk about sort of equitable investment in public green space, this isn't just about money, this is about who is at the table, who is involved in the planning, and how those spaces are equity and from the sort of conception of the space into the actual realization of it. And so, I apologize. In some, access to green space is important because, among other things, it helps people cope with crisis events in order to sort of use this knowledge and prepare for future crises. we need to understand this multidimensionality and this intersectionality of access. And we need to think about equitable, just, and reparative investment in green space and in public green space in our cities, and also our urban, or sorry, in our cities and our suburban and rural areas. So I think that's, if I can get it to advance, I think that's all. That's all. Okay. Thank you all so very much. I'm really looking forward to having some time to talk with you all and hear some questions and have some conversation. So thank you.
Okay, great. Well, well, thank you, Megan, for that. I think, you know, there's lots to think from your presentation. And so as chair, it's my privilege to ask the first question, and maybe just whilst other people just formulate theirs. But just so people know, if you do want to ask a question, please just raise your hand using, you know, the little Zoom reactions feature, or equally just place it in the chat and then we can pose it to Megan. Yeah, so my question was, obviously with the beginning of the pandemic last year, one of the repercussions of that was a very sudden and severe disruption of research that was planned. And so obviously, you know, the research project that that you've just been discussing was actually in response to the pandemic, but it was also designed within the kind of the restrictions that were placed on the research because of the pandemic. So I was really curious when you were talking about doing the survey, and as I think you phrased it, you couldn't go there, you know, as you couldn't, you weren't able to physically be there, or to, you know, to see see where people are, see the kind of rhythms that are pacing their day, or so you were asking respondents to kind of give you a sense of that. And I was just really hoping to hear more about that. You know, you were saying sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. So kind of as, you know, and I think a lot of, you know, graduate students in our department have sort of, who were just about to go and research, who really face this problem of how to do research with those restrictions placed on them. You know, it would be just really nice to hear more about that and your experiences of that, you know, and kind of what that says for how we might do research in the future. And as a second question, if I may, you know, and maybe this straddles the paper you've just presented and the ones that you kind of mentioned at the end, but just in terms of this, of a relationship between people and nature or green spaces, you know, how did this research or research related to it, how did that, could you reflect on the nature of that relationship? So, you know, there was something about the presence of nature or exposure, and I'm thinking of how do we conceptualize that relationship? Is it about purely proximity, consumption, engagement, caring? I'd just like to hear a little bit more about how, you know, about that relationship and how you kind of conceptualize it through this research.
Thanks, Tom. Those are both great questions. So to address the first one, the sort of methodological question first, we sort of have this kind of loose structure in terms of, we had kind of a set of questions and we left it up to the interviewer, like what order you wanted to kind of ask these in and like how you wanted to like position them. But essentially, like, tell me what you see out the window. Tell me what you see when you walk out your door. Tell me about the green space that you go to most frequently. Walk me through how you get there and what it's like to be there. And the intention of these questions, and then sort of dialoguing with people through them, was to just give them a chance to just talk to us about where they were and what their life there was like, and hoping to sort of inspire the little kind of like self-reflective, like, oh, so out my door there's a tree. oh, and I never really thought about it, but there are a lot of cars on this street, like, like asking people to think about something they never really thought about as a way to kind of like get them to talk at us. And sometimes it worked really well because we just basically sort of got to go on this little like narrated tour of their room and their house and their yard and their street, and sort of having them kind of realizing things about that space as they went. But sometimes people sort of assumed that we had an ulterior motive, like we were like, we had a list of things and we were like, did they mention this? Did they mention this? And so they would be very like, I see a tree. So there's a sidewalk, and it'd be like, okay, well, how do we, that's, I don't actually want a list. Like I want you to kind of like be my tour guide here. And so we had to sort of, that's when it landed flat, and you kind of had to be like, oh, okay, you sort of missed the point. How do I get you to find another way to sort of talk? But that was the primary way that we were doing that, by sort of trying to do these little guided tours with people. And I think, that was good for us because we were interested in the space that they were in and the things in it. So that really worked for us. If we had a different set of research questions, I think we would probably have sort of done that a little differently. But the sort of like be a tour guide of your daily life to me kind of way of framing it, I think was really successful for the most part. And when it wasn't, it was one of different interviewers had different ways of dealing with it. The way that I and Liv also did this a lot, handled it was by being like, okay, well, let me tell you about myself, which felt sort of awkward as an interviewer. You sort of don't want to put your experience front and center, but by being like, okay, well, you don't feel comfortable for whatever reason here narrating in too much detail about yourself. So I'll be the one, like I'll open up, I'll become vulnerable to you and tell you about my life and what things are like now. And maybe we can kind of reach a place where a little bit more trust. And that was like, I'm like telling people that I've just met on Zoom, like details about my daily life that like no one else knows. But as a way to just kind of try and demonstrate the level of vulnerability that, I was willing to take in this space and invite people. And that works most of the time. There were still a couple people who were like, nope, not going there. It's not going to happen. And that's fine. I mean, you always have that. But, so I think your second question on sort of the conceptualizing these different relationships to nature is a really excellent question. And one that I've sort of struggled with because we on this team come from such different backgrounds, and we have such different sets of language and assumptions that we're working with. So there's a lot of like trying to figure out what everybody on the team means when we're talking. But in the work that we've been doing to try and really understand sort of connection to nature and these connections as a coping mechanism, we've kind of sort of, Olivia's leading this paper and I don't want to misrepresent her work. We sort of have a kind of different sort of groupings, right? And so one is just kind of this, just noticing. And, not sure that actually is a connection. Like, we're spending a lot of time trying to decide how we define the term connection. But so one of them is just this noticing and this paying attention to things that weren't attended to before. And then another is this sort of realizing of affectedness, like of being affected by something. So not only are you noticing it, but you're also noticing how it affects you. And this is where we're like, okay, well, that seems like maybe we can talk about a connection, right? But you're feeling something in response to it. And you're aware of a feeling of response to it. And then there's this sort of third kind of loose grouping of relationships that is very much about where I would feel comfortable sort of calling it a relationship of sort of a two-way thing where people are sort of recognizing something like, I'm going to use a tree. It feels, if you know my previous research, it's like, of course I chose a tree, but that there's this sense of not only do I see the tree, not only do I recognize that the tree elicits this response in me, but I also feel like I now owe something to this tree. Like I feel some sort of like obligation to it. And whether that's this sense of like, just thinking about like somebody, whether that's a sense of like, I just need to walk, I need to walk by it every day. Like I'm, you know, I don't think anyone thinks the tree expects them, but there's just this sort of like, you know, that is my place to be by that tree, you know, every day. But this sort of sense of connecting back to the entity. And there's this gradation, and I think we're still trying to work through without like having that opportunity to sort of be there with people as they're like experiencing these things, trying to sort of sort through like, what language do we use around these things that kind of accurately represents what's happening there to the best of our knowledge, when our knowledge is so partial and limited because of the medium that we're working in. And it's really, I'd actually welcome any sort of thoughts or suggestions on doing that, because it feels really delicate work. But I hope that answered your questions to some extent, Tom. They were both really great.
Yeah, no, thank you, Megan. That was great, and obviously more to sort of think with and maybe ask in a moment. But let's move on to the next question. So, Ian, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks. Thank you for the presentation. There was a lot there. I think probably everyone could relate to. I think there's a lot of stuff about COVID around at the moment and research and that, but I think also it's something which everyone can connect with because we've been in largely the same position. So, but from my point of view, I mean, I have about probably a dozen questions, but I'll try and cut it down a little bit because, I mean, my situation has changed since COVID as well, because I kind of, my field work ended in March last year when COVID was coming down. So I kind of stayed where my field site was, which is out in the countryside, not in the city where I normally live. So it's been kind of relatable for me living in a completely different environment. I suppose I've never lived in the countryside before. So that was interesting. But also I was quite interested in the way that you went about the research, because I've also become involved in some projects with my industry partners, which are more survey based, which is not something which I have that's related to my PhD topic. It's they're doing kind of surveys into the same thing and trying to involve me into analyzing some of the survey data and stuff. So I was kind of interested in how you integrated this kind of survey approach into interview data. I mean, I did all my interviews first because it was part of my field work, and now I'm sort of looking at data through the lens of the field work I've done and stuff like that. So how do you how do you apply those things? How do you, I mean, with you it's the other way around, so you're looking at the data and you're saying, oh, this is done, so it's directing your questions, whereas for me I kind of see the survey data through the lens of the research I'd previously done. So it's kind of figuring out how to integrate them. And I was kind of also wondering how you analyze the survey data. Was it what sort of statistical analysis can you apply, or did you apply? And how did you choose those methods and things like that as well? Because it's something which I'm trying to learn to do myself, because it's become something which I'm involved in and don't have much experience in. So that a lot of my questions were along those lines. I don't know if that's very specific, but still. And also in general, I was wondering, because I looked at that pie chart as well, how you factor in multiple factors. Like there are things that maybe are associated with going out into green space that aren't necessarily the contact with nature itself. So it's like prior to the pandemic, when I lived in a city, I was, when I went out, I'd go out and get some coffee or do shopping or something like that. When I'm here, I'm just going out for a walk or something. It's less directed. So is it, so I'm kind of missing out on part of the experience that was associated with me walking somewhere to do something. And, you know, it's difficult to separate the factors associated with going outside, which is a fairly broad topic, with all these other kind of day-to-day factors which you might be involved in, you know, going shopping every day, going to meet someone, going to get a drink, whatever it might be. So is it possible to isolate that, or how do you do that? I presume maybe through the interviews and things like that is a way that you can unpick that. And also more broadly, how do you think, or did you get a sense that there are any kind of long-term changes in the way that, I mean, you've addressed this a little bit anyway, but long-term changes post-pandemic, whenever that might be, in the way that people interact with their environments or see their living space? I mean, I know there's some talk here about maybe people, this is tied up with remote working and things as well, but maybe people wanting to move out of the cities a little bit because they don't necessarily need to be there and they'd rather be somewhere more rural and places like that as well. So is there anything that would support the idea that people maybe value it more and so forth, and want to be in other environments other than the one that they were in before, and that sort of thing? So there was a lot of stuff there. I hope I managed to catch all of that. But
yeah. Thank you for those questions, Ian. I'll just try and sort of go through them best as I can. So in terms of integrating the survey and the interview data, I think what I found sort of myself doing was the sort of what I think of, I don't think it's sort of an exclusively anthropological thing. I just think that we sort of spend a lot more time or preoccupation with it, is this sort of asking, why are we asking that question? Or why is this piece of information absent? What am I not knowing based on, you know, this survey question, and why am I not knowing it? And so it's not just, it's that I sort of think of that as very like sort of quintessentially anthropological, like that next step. It's not just like, what do I not know? It's, well, why do I not know it? Right? Like you would sort of go one step further. And so I sort of found myself in this sort of analysis and writing, kind of doing this like Tetris of being like, okay, so here's this piece of information and it tells me this, but it doesn't tell me this or this. Like, so like, you know, just to be very simple, like the survey tells me that going outside for the purpose of being outdoors makes people feel better, but I don't have any idea why that is the case. Like, why do I not know that? And it's like, well, because I have no basis for understanding why people are going outside, what their prior relationship to like the outdoors was, like what they're doing while they're out there, like any of these things. And it's like, okay, so now I'm going to go to my interviews and like, can my interviews answer this question? And like, thankfully for me, we designed them well. And so they did. And I can be like, okay, so I can pull in that piece of information. And it's like, okay, well, now that I know that like people were going to these destinations outside, like for these reasons, like, is there something in the survey that can kind of strengthen that analysis? And then pulling in like, oh, well, we actually did ask people, you know, where they were, this example is falling apart because we did actually ask people on the survey where they were going, but something like how they were getting there, right? We asked people that in the survey and I can pull that in. So it was just kind of this like building with like Lego or something, where I'm sort of constantly asking, like, what is this piece? What can it do? What can it not do? Where does it fit? Where does it not fit? Do I have other pieces? Like, how can I sort of structure them together? Which again, I think as an anthropologist, you're sort of really kind of preconditioned to be okay with that, right? And so I would sort of think about it in that way of sort of not having a master plan, but kind of taking each single like question, each single piece of data, like as it comes to you, and sort of thinking about how it fits with each other individual piece. And then in terms of analyzing the survey data, like the statistics, I do not do the stats analysis. I'm sorry. This is actually my co-author's work. And so this is Elizabeth Cook and Brian Mayu's work in terms of the statistical analyses. And so I found that rather than teach myself, I form collaborations with people who can do the work and who understand the work that I do, and forming good partnerships. So unfortunately, I can't help you out much there. I know they did a lot of ANOVAs and t-tests. We did run some linear regressions. They weren't very helpful. But that's, unfortunately, I can't do much more there. In terms of the sort of multiple factors in green space, we were really careful to sort of separate like going outdoors from going outdoors for the purpose of being outside. And so we also did ask about destination. And we also asked about sort of the community aspects and sort of the like, do you go outside? Trying to understand if people sort of typically went outside to socialize, or whether they, went outside to run errands. Because we were with university students, what we found a lot was people saying like, well, I used to go outside all the time walking from one building to the other to classes, and I didn't really think about it as outdoor time until I stopped being able to do it. And that, so kind of yes and no, I guess, to that question. We tried. I don't think that we sort of really got to the bottom of it, but don't know that you can. And then finally, in terms of long-term changes, this was actually, we really wanted to get at this, and it was really hard because of our population, because they are university students, they're sort of already in a state of flux. And so we did have some people talking about how like, oh, I'm making decisions about like where I want to live next year after I graduate. And I know now that I want to be someplace where I have like good access to nature. Like that's something that I didn't care about before and I care about now. But just as often we have sort of had people being like, I can't really talk about my future plans because I have it's too stressful. Like we had a number of people being like, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I'm freaking out, which understandably. And so I think we sort of all freaking out a little about our futures. And so we weren't able actually to really answer that question as robustly as we'd hoped. But it's an excellent question. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, no, very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So Alex, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for your talk. It really kind of resonated with my kind of personal experience of the pandemic, but also as someone who's also been trying to do sort of ethnographic research during the pandemic. And so I guess like, I partly wanted to just say that I sort of, I recognize the sort of things you've been talking about in my own work. Like I've definitely also seen like people sort of talking about nature as a kind of coping mechanism and using kind of outdoor, pursuing that for the same reason, particularly because I've been working in quite a rural area in like vineyards and orchards and like wildlife conservation groups. And all of those have had this kind of massive kind of influx of volunteers, and they kind of couch their reasons for being there in kind of language to do with mental health a lot of the time. So yeah, it was kind of good to hear, just for my own sake, that was kind of your finding too. And then I guess I wanted to ask, because of stuff that I've kind of noticed, did you sort of hear anything about tensions between people who already kind of worked and inhabited in those outdoor spaces, and then the kind of new influx of visitors? Like, was there any kind of sense of, so there's like an encounter like with nature and with animals, but also with other people who are already there. So I wondered if you could speak about that sort of in terms of any tensions or whatever. And then the other question is, yeah, have you got a kind of sense that maybe recognizing that like being out in nature could be a coping mechanism, has that in any way galvanized a more kind of like broader environmentalism in terms of like, has it kind of politicized people to care more about the environment and maybe do more and change their outlook on nature? I don't know if that would have come up, or whether that would be something you would be looking at in the future. Thanks.
Yeah, those are both great questions. Thank you, Alex. In terms of tensions sort of between people and in these spaces, definitely it came up a couple times, particularly in rural areas where people were sort of like living near state parks, national parks, kind of large outdoor preserve spaces. So a lot of this was out in the Western United States. People who sort of like, that's where they were from and that's where they were living, and like suddenly having this influx of people from nearby cities, whether it's like LA or Phoenix or Denver, like these sort of big Western metropolises in the US, like just flooding the parkland out there, and that being really stressful and upsetting for them. And being like, even during the height of the tourist season, there are not this many people here. And so that was definitely something, it didn't come up a lot because it was only sort of a handful of people who were living in those areas. But in those locations, it was definitely a sort of like, where are all these people coming from? Kind of overrunning the space and the natural areas. So for sure. And then in terms of a broader environmentalism, I think, something that came up, multiple times in interviews was because we were talking to university students. So most of these folks are sort of 22, 23 or younger. And so there's already a really strong understanding in our population about climate change and the crisis and the need for action. And so more than sort of seeing galvanizing a new environmentalism in this population, we saw people making like explicit connections between what is happening now and what is going to happen in the future. And sort of talking about things like, this is a dry run for a climate crisis, or like, hopefully this is much to your statement, like hopefully this is waking people up and making them realize how important our environment is and how important the natural world is. So rather than sort of a new awakening for people, it was sort of strengthening an existing sort of awareness and commitment, which I think is an artifact of the fact that we were talking with like 20-year-old college students who are probably, in the US anyway, like the most vociferous sort of environmental activists that we have right now. And then what I will say though, in terms of the sort of galvanizing new awareness, was the Black Lives Matter protests and uprisings that happened. And we saw that actually galvanizing an awareness in our population about racism and racist harassment in public spaces and in green spaces, and students being very sort of reflective on that moment in the US and thinking about how they were going to sort of respond and change in response to that, which was super interesting, and a whole nother sort of direction and think piece to take our findings. But yeah, I hope that answered your questions, Alex.
Yeah, it did. Thanks. Can I just like add on a quick another question that I also meant to ask, which was, I don't know if you, again, like how the kind of study worked in terms of time, but like were you kind of saying that was more outdoor time, like people were seeking outdoor time more like during the pandemic than they were before, or is it just that you only did the study during the pandemic? And have you got any sense of like it declining? Because I would say as restrictions are easing here, I've noticed like quite a remarkable difference of the number of people who are now not getting outdoors anymore because they don't need to, because like they can go to like pubs and shops and restaurants and stuff instead. So I wondered if that was if you'd noticed that at all.
Yeah, so we asked specifically about like, have you been going outside more or have you been going outside less? And it was pretty much a 50-50 split. We didn't actually get much traction with that question because as often as somebody was like, oh, I'm outside a lot more now, somebody was like, I'm outside a lot less now. And so we asked, for the people who are outside more, we asked if they anticipated that continuing to be the case. And again, it was like half the time people were like, oh yeah, like I'm definitely gonna like work outside more. And then you have people who were like, no, if I'm honest with myself, as soon as like, this is over, I'm going to go back to like working in a coffee shop and not on a patio outside. Like, so it just, we tried and they just couldn't get any traction with that question. Like yeah, but it's a good question. And I think it's going to be really interesting to kind of see how this plays out in the long term for sure.
Claudia, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. First, yeah, thanks a lot, Megan, for this talk. 3 things that came up for me, and at least 2 of them are also closely related to my own experiences. As a PGR researcher who is also significantly impacted by restrictions on fieldwork. And in this context, I'm now writing a paper with a couple of co-authors on something that you mentioned briefly in your talk, which is how to build rapport in in an online environment, in digital ethnography, where you don't have all this, say, time for building relationships. And it didn't probably matter that much in your more sociological kind of study, because this is very much internet interview based. But I was just wondering if you might have, I don't know, thought a bit more about how rapport plays out in a context where this like traditional notions of co-presence and being there and sharing time and like all these surely contested ideas around rapport building, but still in a way relevant and practiced. Preconditions or assumed preconditions for building rapport. How does changes if you're conducting online interviews? And then the next question is related to the notion of well-being, because I know like there's this like in psychology it's such a loaded term, and there are so many studies about finding out about the level of well-being of family, society, country, whatsoever. And I was wondering how this notion was figured in your survey or also in the interview questions. Like, did you ask explicitly how was your level of well-being, or how did you get to the measurement of well-being in both, like first in the survey and then in the interview, and how then you make those 2 things speak together? Like, how do you measure well-being? And the last question that I have was, you were looking for how important green spaces are for well-being, but then like sometimes when you conduct interviews, you want to hear one thing, but people get you somewhere completely different. Now, like you want to hear about green spaces, but they want to talk about like how much they are affected by, I don't know, anxieties or different issues. And I was wondering how the kind of financial and economic anxieties, except the ecological ones, were important in your interviews, as also something that is very related to my own experience in the pandemic. That of course, like there are a lot of anxieties, but as a PGR student, and you were after all also talking to students, there's such a limited amount of stipend and time to conduct, like to finish your diploma, to conduct your research, to finish something which is like in its temporality always kind of fixed to an old system, which is outdated now, at least not fitting to the pandemic time. So I wondered if this turned out as well. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Those are all excellent questions. So for the first one about building rapport, I think I don't know. I think for me, like there isn't a sort of blanket answer. I found for myself that like, while I was always really intentional about like, how am I going to build rapport with this person? Am I doing it? Is this working? Like in the moment of the interview, like I did not have any sort of preconceived notions about like what specifically I would do. It was sort of more of this like palette of things. Like we had these sort of like, take me on a tour of your space sort of questions. The other question that we asked was like, you know, did you go home? Like, where are you now? And like, talk me through your decision-making process of why you're there, right? To sort of understand, like, did you go home to live with your parents? Did you go to live with friends? Did you stay where you were? Like, they're sort of, you know, talk me. So we had these sort of different kind of like, sort of, you know, little bowls of questions that we could kind of pick from to try and get people talking and get to know people a little bit. But it was sort of like, also this awareness of like, it's going to be really different with every single person and where they're at as an individual, their backgrounds, where they're coming from, but also like where they're at that day. Like I interviewed a guy whose dog died like that morning. And I was like, are you sure you want to be here? And he's like, yes. And I'm like, okay, well, we're coming into this interview completely sideways. Cause like, talk to me about your dog. How are you feeling? Like, how can I like support you in this time? Et cetera, right? So it was, while the intentionality of building rapport was there, the sort of like preconception of like what I would need to do it varied. The other thing that I think is so important, and let's see if I can just, is this. We intentionally did not use backgrounds. We intentionally did not use positioned, prepared spaces. We were like, if your cat or your dog jumps up as an interviewer, if you're eating a snack, if you're drinking, like I'm in the middle of moving, this is what my space looks like. Like there is coming to it with this understanding of just being like, this is who I am right now. And I'm going to allow myself to be sort of more open and vulnerable, which was very different for me than how I had done like field work and interviews before, where I was very careful to curate myself and my personality in order to make people feel as comfortable as possible, right? Like the same goal of building rapport and being comfortable. But before, when I was with people, it was like, you know, I would think very carefully about like, well, what shirt am I wearing? If I'm going to go talk to sort of an older kind of, I know them to be sort of a fuddy-duddy person, I'm probably going to wear like a more sort of conservative outfit than if I'm going to go like meet somebody at the bar and have a beer to talk. I'm going to like dress like those things. And in this instance, it was like, we're just going to be sort of the messy, complicated people we are and allow that to be a chance for people. So I guess what I'm trying to say there is, instead of thinking of rapport as just like something I build with that person, giving them like the tools to build it with me too. And to be like, oh, look at your cat. Oh, why do you have all those boxes in the background? Like allow them to do that back with me. Which, you know, when you're in the field, you don't actually have that capability because you're often like not sitting with people in your messy living room doing an interview, right? You're like, I mean, I'm doing it out like in parks and cafes and like other and more public spaces. I'm not doing it in a private space. And so I think that was really important for thinking about that. In terms of the idea of well-being, sorry, I spent a lot of time on that question, but I think it's so important. I could talk about this for such a long time. I work with an environmental psychologist, and she has a very sort of, well-being is something that you measure with these tested scales that have been tested in these experimental conditions. And being sort of an anthropologist, I'm like, I don't know about this. And so I think in this project and in like a lot of the projects I've been doing in this sort of group at Columbia and Barnard, been trying to sort of delicately balance, right? And so in the survey, we used a standard 10-point assessment scale, and we asked about well-being. To use the language of psychologists, we asked about life satisfaction, momentary happiness, and then happiness outdoors, right? But in the analysis of that and what that means, and particularly in the interviews and asking people, was where I was kind of like, you gave me a relative level, and that's really great. But like, I don't know your endpoints of those, like the beginning and endpoint of that scale varies for every individual. And like which factors you brought into like distilling your life satisfaction down to the number 6, like I have no idea. And so trying to be very cognizant about saying things like, this is sort of self-assessed and self-reported well-being. So I don't actually know what I measured. Like the person I measured knows what I measured, but I don't. And then in the interview, trying to sort of talk about like, you know, well, how are you feeling today? I feel good. Well, we would ask people like, how do you know you feel good? Like, how does that register for you? And then giving people a chance to tell us everything that goes into picking the number 6 on the scale, right? And what their high and low points are and things like that. And it's a very, I find it delicate balance, and I don't know that it's always successful, but yeah. And then that answers your second question. That gives people a chance to talk to us about their financial and economic anxieties. And we actually don't, in the interviews, we didn't introduce the idea of green space until like halfway through. We just initially were talking about like, where are you? Why are you there? You know, what's it like? Talk to me about your space and your decision-making process, and like, how's it going today? And how do you know? And it's like, we're like halfway through the interview before I'm like, green space, you know? And so trying to sort of start from a really open place and allowing people to bring up the financial and the economic. We chose not to ask about it directly because it can be very anxiety inducing, and I didn't want to like be like, so how you doing financially? Like it's very off-putting, but we did make sure there was a space for people to bring it up because it's a huge part of the experience for a lot of people. And that came up for sure.
Thank you so much. And I know we're running out of time. I have a very, very short final question. Like, how did you get so many people to join the survey and the interviews? Like, just like how did you do that?
Well, we emailed the entire student body of Barnard College, and so that was very helpful. And the entire engineering school at Columbia University. So we had access to these listservs. But beyond that, we tried initially to go to like schools and be like, can we distribute this to your sort of all student listserv? And they were like, no. So we were like, we just started asking professors, like, you know, I asked a guy I went to undergrad with who's a math professor now. And I was like, Matt, would you distribute this in your department? And he was like, sure. And we just basically cashed in all these personal favors with everyone we knew around. We were like scratching our heads, like, do you know anyone in South Dakota? Trying to get, but because we were going through professors, I think we had such a really good response rate because people, like we had, I bring up the math professor, we had one person like say in comments, like, I just did this study because I really like my math professor. Like, I hope it helps you. Like, could have cared less about what we were doing. And so I think it was that we sort of we used our personal connections to people who had personal connections to students who could take the survey. And that I think was really helpful. But yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, obviously we've just passed time. Do you have a couple of minutes to stay, Megan? Just a couple of minutes more?
Yeah, sure.
Brief question. But just before that, I just wanted to say that this is, for everyone that's attending, this is like the second of 7 seminars that will be happening at the same time each week, which is on a Wednesday, 4 p.m. London time. You can find out more about the seminar series on our Facebook group, and I would really appreciate if someone could put that in the chat. Thank you, Claudia. And also, all of the talks or presentations are being recorded and will be put on our YouTube channel, which is also going to be in the chat. So next week we have Dr. Ognjen Koyenic. I hope my pronunciation is okay, Yuli, from the University of Pittsburgh, who will be presenting on "This Machine Should Be in a Museum, Managing Unevenness in a Worker-Owned Company," which sounds fascinating. But over to you, Vlad, for the last question.
Right, thanks, Ton. Yeah, fascinating presentation. Thanks a lot. I also would have like 20 different questions, but I'll just ask one. And I know that with all of this data, you might not have it, but I was really, really curious if you had any insight, because it's a nationwide survey, any insight into regional differences. And so say someone from the Midwest and someone from, I don't know, the East Coast and the West Coast, and I don't know, someone from Minnesota would have a different experience with someone from South Dakota, as you mentioned. And also whether you had enough data time-wise to get seasonal differences of enjoying green spaces, whether that was in the interviews or not. So yeah.
Great question. We didn't look nationally at regional differences. We did look at the Northeast of the US, so Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and in particular because at the time that we did our survey in the early spring, this was sort of the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic in the US, and it's also the most sort of densely urban area in the country. And so we assumed that we would see a difference there. Not really. It didn't really show up. And so we didn't see a difference there. So we didn't sort of bother looking at the rest of the country, because we're like, if, you know, it would be a good to do, but as sort of working with deadlines and limited resources, we're like, well, if we didn't see it there, we probably didn't see it anywhere else. So we'll just table that analysis and maybe we'll do it later when we have time. I would say the one thing that came up in our interviews as a big difference was that we had a cohort in Alaska for some reason, and they were doing great. Like the folks in Alaska were fine, like little had changed for them. And so I can only extrapolate from like those 5 interviews that the folks in really remote areas, like really remote, were, you know, so I would guess that, you know, similarly remote areas would have sort of a similar experience, but yeah, we didn't really beyond that. In terms of seasonal difference, we only did this in the spring. We talked about doing a follow-up in the fall, but we're just all not in a place where we can pull that off. I'm doing a research project right now, my current project, that looks at seasonal differences in what people sort of perceive as a value or a benefit in their green spaces. And we're in the middle of our sort of fully leafed out vegetation season data collection. And we'll be looking in the fall once the leaves are off the trees.
Right.
So stay tuned.
No, fantastic. Thank you.
Well, that seems like a really nice note to end on. So yeah, if you could just join me in thanking Megan for presenting as part of the seminar series. It's always funny doing this on Zoom, but that was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the last note, I just wanted to ask really briefly, is there anything that we should be looking forward to, whether, you know, you've mentioned briefly, but whether in your own work or someone else's?
Yeah, unfortunately, right now, all of these papers are sort of being written or under review. So they're all sort of under review or forthcoming. So other than just look for them, fingers crossed in the next year, don't really have a lot to plug at the moment, but thank you for the opportunity to do so.
Brilliant.